Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from by leaving a comment below. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling Enterprises boardroom as Ethan Caldwell stared out at the Seattle skyline, his mind far from the quarterly reports spread across the mahogany table. 28 years old and heir to a business empire worth hundreds of millions, Ethan should have been focused on profit margins and market expansion. Instead, all he could think about was the woman who had changed everything, Nora Whitman. Her name alone sent warmth through his chest, a feeling that had grown stronger every day for the past 8 months. From the moment she'd walked into his life as a junior marketing consultant, everything had shifted. Her intelligence was razor-sharp, her laugh infectious, and her refusal to be intimidated by his family's wealth both refreshing and captivating. "Ethan, are you even listening?" His mother's voice cut through his reverie like a blade. Lydia Sterling sat at the head of the table, her platinum blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, her piercing eyes fixed on him with barely concealed irritation. At 55, she commanded every room she entered, her presence as imposing as the diamond tennis bracelet that caught the light as she drummed her manicured fingers impatiently. "The Peterson merger requires your signature," she continued, sliding a stack of papers toward him. "This deal will expand our Pacific Northwest holdings by 30%. Ethan forced himself to focus on the documents, but his phone buzzed with a text message. Despite his mother's disapproving glare, he glanced at the screen. "Missing you already. Dinadot." A smile tugged at his lips. Nora had left the office early for a dentist appointment, and already the day felt incomplete without her presence. "Who is it?" Lydia's tone was sharp. "No one important," Ethan lied quickly. But Lydia's eyes had already narrowed. She'd built her empire by reading people, by spotting weaknesses, and exploiting them. The look on her son's face told her everything she needed to know. "We need to discuss your future, Ethan. Your grandfather built this company from nothing, and I've tripled its value since taking over. But legacy means nothing if there's no proper heir to continue it." Ethan signed the merger documents without really reading them. "I'm here, aren't I? I'm learning the business. Learning isn't enough. You need to start thinking about marriage, about producing an heir. The Thompson girl would be perfect. Old money, good breeding, the right connections. Mother, don't mother me. You're 28 years old, and I won't have you wasting time with inappropriate relationships." The words hit their mark, and Ethan's head snapped up. "What's that supposed to mean?" Lydia leaned back in her chair, studying him with the same calculating expression she used during hostile takeovers. "I'm not blind, Ethan. I see how you look at that marketing girl. What's her name?" "Whitman." Ethan's blood ran cold. He'd been careful, or so he thought. Their relationship had started slowly, coffee meetings that turned into dinner dates, business discussions that became personal conversations. They'd kept things professional at the office, but apparently not professional enough. "Nora is a valued employee," he said carefully. "Nora," Lydia repeated, tasting the name like it left a bitter aftertaste. "How quaint. And I suppose you think she cares about you for yourself, not for what you represent." "It's not like that. It's exactly like that. You're worth more money than she'll see in 10 lifetimes. Do you really think she'd give you a second glance if you were pumping gas for a living?" Ethan stood abruptly, anger flashing in his dark eyes. "You don't know her. I know her type. I've seen dozens of them over the years, all circling around you like vultures. Pretty little things with empty bank accounts and big ambitions." "Stop." But Lydia was just getting started. She rose from her chair with predatory grace, moving around the table until she stood directly in front of her son. "She's playing you, Ethan, and frankly, I'm disappointed that you're naive enough to fall for it. I love her." The words hung in the air between them like a declaration of war. Lydia's face went perfectly still, her expression shifting from irritation to something far more dangerous. "Love," she said softly. "How romantic. Tell me, does she love you enough to turn down money? Because I guarantee you, son, everyone has a price." Ethan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a warning tone. "Stay away from her." "Or what? You'll choose her over your family, over everything we've built?" Lydia laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're more like your father than I thought." He was foolish about women, too. The mention of his father, dead for 5 years now from a heart attack, hit Ethan like a physical blow. His parents' marriage had been cold, loveless, more business arrangement than romance. He'd sworn he would never end up like that. "I won't discuss this with you anymore," Ethan said, grabbing his jacket from the back of his chair. "We're not finished here." "Yes, we are." He was halfway to the door when Lydia called out again, her voice carrying across the room with ominous certainty. "If you think I'll stand by and watch you destroy everything we've worked for, you're mistaken." Ethan paused at the door, looking back at his mother. For a moment, he saw past the designer clothes and expensive jewelry to something darker underneath, something that made his skin crawl. "Don't threaten me, Mother, and don't even think about threatening her." He left without another word, but Lydia's voice followed him into the hallway. "I don't make threats, darling. I make promises." 3 hours later, Ethan sat across from Nora at their favorite restaurant, a small Italian place tucked away from the bustle of downtown Seattle. The warm lighting cast a golden glow across her brown skin, and her dark eyes sparkled as she told him about her day. She wore a simple black dress that probably cost less than his mother's daily spa treatments. But she looked more beautiful than any woman he'd ever seen. "You're quiet tonight," she observed, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "Everything okay?" Ethan turned his palm up to catch her fingers, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. "Just work stress, nothing important." But as he looked into her trusting eyes, his mother's words echoed in his mind. "I've protected this family's interests before, and I'll do it again." "Nora," he said suddenly, surprising himself, "what would you say if I told you I wanted to leave Seattle, start fresh, somewhere else?" She tilted her head, studying his face. "I'd say you must have had a really bad day at the office." "Why? Are you thinking about it? Maybe, would you come with me?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications. They'd been together for 8 months, but they'd never talked about the future, never made any real commitments. The intensity in Ethan's voice suggested this was about more than just a career change. "Ethan, what's really going on?" He wanted to tell her everything. About his mother's threats, about the pressure to marry someone appropriate, about the suffocating weight of expectations that had followed him his entire life. But looking at her worried expression, he couldn't bring himself to burden her with the full truth. "I just love you," he said instead, lifting her hand to his lips. "More than I ever thought possible." Nora's face softened, and she leaned forward to kiss him gently. "I love you too. Whatever's bothering you, we'll figure it out together." As they left the restaurant that night, Ethan felt a mixture of hope and dread settling in his chest. He loved Nora with every fiber of his being, and he was beginning to realize that might not be enough to protect her from the storm that was coming. In her penthouse apartment across the city, Lydia Sterling stood at her own window, phone pressed to her ear as she gazed out at the lights of Seattle. "I need you to gather information on someone," she said to the private investigator on the other end of the line. "Everything you can find. Financial records, family background, personal history. I want to know what skeletons are hiding in her closet." She gave him Nora's name and address, then hung up with a satisfied smile. The war for her son's future was about to begin, and Lydia Sterling had never lost a war in her life. Chapter 2. The Ultimatum. 2 weeks had passed since the confrontation in the boardroom, and Lydia Sterling now possessed a thick file containing every detail of Nora Whitman's life. The private investigator had been thorough, perhaps too thorough. What Lydia had expected to find were the usual red flags: debt, a questionable past, evidence of gold-digging behavior. Instead, the report painted a picture of a woman who was frustratingly clean. Nora had grown up in modest circumstances in Portland, the daughter of a nurse and a high school teacher. She'd worked her way through college on scholarships and part-time jobs, graduated summa cum laude with a degree in marketing, and had been steadily climbing the corporate ladder through merit alone. Her credit score was excellent, her references glowing, and there wasn't so much as a parking ticket in her background. The only potential weakness Lydia could identify was Nora's younger brother, Ben, who struggled with addiction and had been in and out of rehab facilities for the past 3 years. But even that seemed to work in Nora's favor. She'd been paying for his treatment out of her own pocket, demonstrating both loyalty and financial responsibility. It was maddening. Lydia had hoped to find ammunition to use against the woman who threatened her carefully laid plans for Ethan's future. Instead, she discovered that Nora Whitman was exactly what she appeared to be: intelligent, hard-working, and genuinely in love with her son, which made her even more dangerous. Lydia closed the file and leaned back in her leather chair, considering her options. Direct confrontation had failed. Ethan had made his position clear. Character assassination would be difficult given Nora's spotless record. That left only one viable approach: make Nora an offer she couldn't refuse. She picked up her phone and dialed her assistant. Schedule a lunch meeting with Nora Whitman for tomorrow, somewhere private. The Fairmont Olympics should do. Should I tell her what it's regarding, Mrs. Sterling? Tell her I'd like to discuss her future with the company. The next day, Nora arrived at the Fairmont Olympics Georgian restaurant precisely on time, dressed in her best business suit. She'd been surprised by the invitation. She'd barely spoken to Ethan's mother beyond basic pleasantries at company events. Mrs. Sterling was known for her ice-cold demeanor and surgical precision in business dealings, but Nora had assumed she was beneath the woman's notice. Lydia was already seated at a corner table positioned to ensure privacy. She studied Nora as she approached, taking in every detail. The young woman was undeniably beautiful, with an elegant bearing that suggested natural grace rather than cultivated sophistication. Her clothes were well chosen but inexpensive, and she moved with the confidence of someone comfortable in her own skin. "Miss Whitman," Lydia said, rising slightly from her chair. "Thank you for joining me." "Mrs. Sterling, thank you for the invitation." Nora took her seat, accepting the menu from the hovering waiter. They made small talk through the appetizer course. Market trends, the Seattle weather, industry gossip. Lydia was an expert at reading people, and she watched Nora carefully. For any signs of nervousness or calculation, she found neither. The young woman was poised and articulate, answering questions directly without volunteering unnecessary information. It wasn't until the main course arrived that Lydia decided to show her hand. "I suppose you're wondering why I asked you here," she began, cutting into her salmon with surgical precision. "I assumed it was about work, perhaps a new project." In a manner of speaking, Lydia set down her fork and fixed Nora with her steely gaze. "I'm going to be direct with you, Miss Whitman. I know about your relationship with my son." Nora's hand stilled halfway to her wineglass, but her expression remained calm. "I see. I imagine you do. You're an intelligent woman, which makes this conversation easier. You understand that Ethan's position in this family comes with certain expectations, such as marriage to someone suitable, children who will carry on the family legacy, a stable foundation for the business empire we've spent generations building." Nora finally reached for her wine, taking a small sip before responding, "And you believe I'm not suitable? It's nothing personal. You seem like a lovely young woman, but you must understand that Ethan's marriage isn't just about personal happiness. It's about dynasty, about preserving what we've built. He needs a wife who can move in our social circles, who understands the responsibilities that come with wealth, who can provide the right connections and background." "I see." Nora's voice remained level, but something flickered in her dark eyes. "And what role do you see Ethan's feelings playing in this decision?" "Ethan is young. He thinks with his heart rather than his head. In time, he'll understand that infatuation isn't the same as love, and that love isn't always enough to build a successful marriage." Lydia reached into her purse and withdrew a cream-colored envelope, placing it on the table between them. "Which brings me to why we're really here." Nora stared at the envelope but made no move to touch it. "What is that?" "Your future." "Open it." With obvious reluctance, Nora picked up the envelope and broke the seal. Inside was a cashier's check for $1 million made out in her name. Her eyes widened, and for the first time since arriving, she looked genuinely shaken. "I don't understand." "I think you do. $1 million, free and clear. Enough to pay off any debts, help your brother with his medical expenses, set yourself up comfortably anywhere you choose. All you have to do is disappear from Ethan's life. Clean break. No contact. No explanations. Just gone." Nora stared at the check, her hands trembling slightly. "You want to pay me to leave your son? I want to offer you an opportunity to start fresh. You're young, talented, beautiful. With this money, you could go anywhere. Be anything. Why limit yourself to Seattle, to Ethan? Because I love him. Do you? Or do you love what he represents? The security, the lifestyle, the escape from financial worry. Nora's eyes flashed with anger. How dare you? I'm not judging you. I'm simply acknowledging reality. Love is a luxury that people in your position can rarely afford. This check represents freedom, real freedom. The kind that doesn't depend on anyone else's feelings or circumstances. And if I refuse? Lydia's smile was razor sharp. Then you'll be making a terrible mistake. Ethan will tire of you eventually. Men like him always do. You'll find yourself discarded, used up, with nothing to show for it but a broken heart and wasted years. Take the money now while you still have the chance to control your own destiny. Nora carefully placed the check back in the envelope and set it on the table. I need to ask you something, Mrs. Sterling. When you look at your son, do you see a person capable of making his own decisions? Do you see someone worthy of respect? I see someone who needs protection from his own naivety. And when you look at me, what do you see? Lydia's expression was predatory as she studied the young woman across from her. I see a threat to everything I've worked to build. I see someone who could destroy my family's future with good intentions and romantic notions. You don't see a person who loves your son enough to make him happy. You don't see someone who might actually be good for him. Happiness is temporary. Legacy is forever. Nora stood abruptly, leaving the envelope on the table. I won't take your money, Mrs. Sterling. And I won't leave Ethan. What we have is real, and no amount of manipulation or bribery will change that. Sight down. Lydia's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. We are not finished. Yes, we are. If you walk away from this table without that check, you'll regret it. I promise you that. Nora paused, looking back at the older woman. Is that a threat? It's a prediction. You think you know my son, but you don't understand the world he comes from. The pressure, the expectations, the weight of responsibility. You think love will be enough to sustain you through all of that, but it won't. One day, you'll wake up and realize you're drowning, and there won't be anyone there to save you. Maybe, but that's my choice to make. As Nora walked away, Lydia sat alone at the table, staring at the discarded envelope. She'd underestimated the young woman's resolve, but that was a mistake she wouldn't make again. If money wouldn't solve the problem, she'd have to find another way. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. It belonged to a man who specialized in solving problems that couldn't be handled through conventional means. Their relationship went back years, built on mutual benefit and absolute discretion. It's me, she said when he answered. I need to discuss a sensitive matter. Can you meet me tonight? That evening, as Nora told Ethan about the lunch meeting and showed him the check, Lydia Sterling was in a dimly lit bar across town, discussing a very different kind of transaction. The man across from her listened without comment as she outlined her problem, his face expressionless. It needs to look natural, she concluded. An accident, maybe a mugging gone wrong, something that won't raise questions. These things take time to arrange properly, and they're expensive. Money isn't an object, but time is. I need this resolved within 2 weeks. The man nodded slowly. I'll need a week to set things up. Maybe 2. You have 1 week. And remember, if this traces back to me in any way, it won't. It never does. As they shook hands in the shadows, neither of them noticed the security camera in the corner of the bar, recording every moment of their conversation. Sometimes, the very technology that made modern crime easier also made it far more dangerous. But Lydia Sterling had never been one to worry about consequences she couldn't see. Chapter 3. The Kidnapping. The first thing Nora noticed when she woke up was the smell, a mixture of motor oil, damp concrete, and something else she couldn't identify. The second thing was the duct tape across her mouth and the rope binding her wrists behind her back. The third was the crushing realization that she was no longer in her apartment. Her head throbbed where they'd hit her, and it took several moments for her vision to clear enough to make out her surroundings. She was in what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse, lying on a thin mattress in the corner of a large, empty space. Weak sunlight filtered through grimy windows high above, suggesting it was morning, though she had no idea which morning. The last thing she remembered was leaving her apartment for work 3 days ago. She'd been walking to her car in the underground parking garage when she'd heard footsteps behind her. Before she could turn around, something had struck her head, and darkness had claimed her. "She's awake." The voice came from somewhere behind her. Nora twisted as much as her bonds would allow and saw 3 men standing near a folding table covered with maps and what looked like surveillance photos. The one who'd spoken was tall and lean, with graying hair and cold blue eyes. The other 2 were younger, both built like street fighters, with the kind of casual violence that suggested they were comfortable with their chosen profession. "Good," the older man said, approaching her with measured steps. "We need to talk." He knelt down beside the mattress and studied her face with clinical detachment. "My name is Kane. These are my associates, Holt and Ramsey. We're going to be spending some time together, so I thought introductions were in order." Nora tried to speak, but the tape muffled any sound she made. Kane noticed her struggle and shook his head. "I'll remove that in a moment. But first, some ground rules. You're going to want to scream, to fight, to make demands. I understand that. It's natural. But it won't help you. And it will only make things more difficult for everyone involved. Do you understand?" Nora nodded, her dark eyes never leaving his face. "Excellent. Now, I'm going to take off the tape, and you're going to speak quietly and calmly. If you scream, it goes back on, and we'll wait another day before trying this again. Clear?" Another nod. Kane carefully peeled away the duct tape, and Nora winced as it pulled at her skin. She worked her jaw for a moment, then looked up at her captor. "Why?" she whispered, straight to the point. "I appreciate that. The why is simple. Someone wants you gone permanently." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Gone. Dead," Kane clarified with brutal honesty. The client was very specific about that. Nora's mind raced, trying to process what she was hearing. Who? Who wants me dead? That's not really your concern anymore. What matters is what happens next. And what happens next? Kane stood and walked back to the table, picking up one of the photographs. From where she lay, Nora could see it was a picture of her leaving her office building. "Originally, we were supposed to kill you and make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Stage it in the parking garage where we grabbed you. Leave your body where it would be found quickly. Clean, simple, no complications. Originally, plans change. See, when we did our research on you, we discovered something the client failed to mention." Kane held up another photo. This one, clearly taken with a telephoto lens, showed Nora in profile, and even from across the room, she could see the slight curve of her belly that had become noticeable only in the past few weeks. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, and Kane nodded. 16 weeks along, according to your medical records. Congratulations, by the way. Boy or girl? I don't know yet. The words came out in a whisper. Doesn't matter. What matters is that I don't kill pregnant women. Call it a character flaw, but every man has his limits. Relief flooded through Nora, followed immediately by confusion. Then why am I here? Why haven't you let me go? Because the client is still paying me to solve a problem. If I can't solve it one way, I need to find another. Kane sat down the photos and turned to face her fully, which brings us to the current situation. I don't understand. The client believes you're dead. As far as anyone knows, you disappeared from that parking garage 3 nights ago. Your car was found abandoned, your purse missing, blood on the concrete. The police are treating it as a kidnapping, possibly murder. Your boyfriend is beside himself with grief. Ethan. Nora's heart clenched as she thought about what he must be going through. You have to let me contact him. He needs to know I'm alive. That's not going to happen. At least not yet. Kane pulled a folding chair over to the mattress and sat down, his elbows resting on his knees. Here's the deal. The client wants you gone from Ethan Caldwell's life. Originally, that meant dead. But there's another way to accomplish the same goal. What way? You disappear. Permanently. New identity, new life, far away from Seattle. To everyone you've ever known, Nora Whitman died in that parking garage. That's insane. He won't do it. You will. Because the alternative is death. Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but eventually. The client has made it very clear that your continued existence in Ethan's life is unacceptable. This way, everyone gets what they want. The client gets you out of the picture, you get to live, and your baby gets to be born. Nora stared at him, trying to find some hint of mercy in his cold blue eyes. And Ethan? Ethan mourns you and moves on. Eventually, he'll find someone else, someone the client approves of. He'll have the life he was meant to have. You don't know him. He won't move on. He'll never stop looking for me. People always say that, but grief fades, and life has a way of forcing people forward whether they want to go or not. Kane stood and walked back to the table, returning with a manila envelope. Inside this envelope is everything you need for a new life. Social security number, birth certificate, driver's license, passport. There's also a bank account with $500,000, your client's final payment to ensure your cooperation. I won't take blood money. It's not blood money. Think of it as child support. The father of your child is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. This is a fraction of what the baby would inherit if Ethan knew it existed. The casual cruelty of the words made Nora sick. He has a right to know about his child. He has no rights in this situation. Neither do you. This isn't a negotiation. It's a choice between life and death. Kane dropped the envelope on the mattress beside her. You have 24 hours to decide. Tomorrow night, we'll either put you on a plane to start your new life, or we'll finish what we originally came here to do. The choice is yours. He motioned to his associates, and the three men moved toward the far end of the warehouse, leaving Nora alone with her thoughts and the envelope that represented either salvation or betrayal. As the hours passed, she thought about Ethan, about the life they'd planned together, the future that had seemed so bright just days ago. She thought about the baby growing inside her, Ethan's child, who would never know their father if she took Kane's deal. But she also thought about Kane's cold certainty that the alternative was death. Someone wanted her gone badly enough to hire professional killers. Someone with enough money and power to make her disappear without a trace. The realization of who that someone must be hit like a physical blow. Lydia Sterling. Ethan's mother had made her position clear during their lunch meeting, but Nora had never imagined the woman would go this far. As night fell, one of Kane's men brought her water and a sandwich. She ate mechanically, her mind churning through possibilities. Could she escape? The warehouse seemed secure, and even if she got away, Kane had made it clear that the threat wouldn't end there. Could she contact the police? What proof did she have? And even if they believed her, would they be able to protect her and her child from someone with Lydia Sterling's resources? The envelope sat beside her like a poisonous temptation. $500,000, a new identity, safety for her and her baby. All she had to do was let Ethan believe she was dead. By dawn, her decision was made. Kane appeared at her side as the first light filtered through the windows. Well, I need guarantees, Nora said, her voice stronger than she felt. I need to know that Ethan will be safe, that you won't hurt him to ensure his compliance with whatever story you tell. The client has no interest in harming Ethan. The whole point is to protect him from what they see as a destructive relationship. And you'll make sure my brother gets the medical help he needs. Anonymous donations to cover his treatment. That can be arranged. Nora closed her eyes, feeling a piece of her soul die. Then I'll take your deal. But I have one condition. You're not in a position to make conditions. This one you'll accept because it serves your client's interests. She looked up at Kane with eyes that had aged years in the past few days. I want Ethan to think I chose to leave. I want him to believe I took money and ran. It will hurt him, but it will also help him hate me. Hatred is easier to recover from than grief. Kane studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering in his cold blue eyes. That's surprisingly practical of you, and cruel. I love him too much to leave him mourning a ghost for the rest of his life. Then we have a deal. As Kane's men prepared to transport her to the airport, Nora took one last look at the warehouse that had been her prison. Somewhere across the city, Ethan was probably still searching for her, still hoping for her safe return. She pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling the slight swell where their child grew. I'm sorry, she whispered, not sure if she was apologizing to Ethan, to the baby, or to herself. But survival required sacrifice. And sometimes love meant letting go. The plane tickets in her new identity were for Portland, Oregon. Close enough to feel like home, far enough to stay hidden. As the car pulled away from the warehouse, carrying her toward a life that felt like death, Nora Whitman closed her eyes and tried to imagine a future where this choice would make sense. She failed. Chapter 4. Survival and Exile. The name on her new driver's license was Elise Morgan. The apartment Kane's people had arranged for her in Portland was small but clean, furnished with the kind of generic furniture that came from rental companies. It felt like a hotel room where someone might stay forever, temporary and sterile, lacking any trace of personality or warmth. Elise, now she had to remember that, stood at the window of her new home, watching the rain fall on unfamiliar streets. 3 weeks had passed since the warehouse, and she was still adjusting to the reality of her new existence. Every morning, she woke up expecting to be back in Seattle, back in her real life. Every morning, the truth hit her anew. She was dead to the world she'd known, dead to Ethan. The pregnancy was progressing normally, according to the doctor Kane had arranged for her to see. Dr. Rebecca Lynn was a kind woman who asked no questions about Elise Morgan's sudden appearance in Portland or her lack of medical history beyond what the fake documents provided. The babies, as it turned out, were healthy and developing on schedule. Twins. The ultrasound had revealed that, surprised during her second visit, 2 heartbeats, 2 tiny forms growing inside her, Ethan's children, who would never know their father's name. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been running from one threat to her life, only to discover she was carrying 2 lives that made her exile even more complete. There was no going back now, no way to explain a sudden reappearance after death with 2 children in tow. Kane had been thorough in creating her new identity. Elise Morgan had a work history as a freelance graphic designer, which allowed her to work from home and avoid too many questions about her past. The bank account he promised was real, the money sitting there like 30 pieces of silver. She tried not to touch it at first, living off her savings, but pregnancy had its own demands, and practical concerns eventually outweighed her principles. She'd established a routine of sorts. Morning walks when the weather permitted, doctor's appointments, grocery shopping, and long hours at her computer designing logos and websites for small businesses. It was honest work that kept her mind occupied and provided enough income that she wouldn't have to rely entirely on the blood money. But the evenings were the hardest. When the work was done and the apartment fell silent, there was nothing to distract her from the magnitude of what she'd lost. She'd taken to watching the Seattle news online, hungry for any glimpse of her former life. Ethan appeared occasionally in business segments, looking hollow-eyed and older than his 28 years. His mother, Lydia, was often at his side during public appearances, her hand resting possessively on his arm. The official story of Nora Whitman's disappearance had evolved over the weeks. Initially treated as a kidnapping, it had gradually shifted to suspected murder when no ransom demands materialized. Then, 6 weeks after her disappearance, Kane had kept his promise about making Ethan hate her memory. An envelope had arrived at Ethan's office, postmarked from Mexico and containing Nora's engagement ring, the one Ethan had given her just days before the kidnapping, along with a note in handwriting that perfectly matched her own. The letter explained that she'd grown tired of living a lie, that she'd realized she couldn't marry someone just for their money, and that she'd taken a payment from his mother to disappear permanently. Elise had watched Ethan's press conference about the discovery with tears streaming down her face. His pain was visible even through the carefully controlled corporate demeanor. But underneath it, she could see the anger beginning to take hold, the hurt of betrayal mixing with grief in a way that would poison his memories of their time together. It was exactly what she'd asked for, and it was destroying her. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the screen, her hands resting on her growing belly. "I'm so sorry." But Kane had been right about one thing. Survival required sacrifice. The twins were moving now, little flutters that reminded her constantly that this wasn't just about her anymore. Whatever Lydia Sterling was capable of, Elise couldn't risk exposing her children to that threat. A knock at her door interrupted her brooding. Elise wiped her eyes and checked the peephole, seeing a young woman about her own age holding a casserole dish and smiling uncertainly. "Hi," the woman said when Elise opened the door. "I'm Sarah Tate from 3B. I know you've been here a few weeks, and I wanted to welcome you to the building. That's very kind of you. I'm Elise Morgan. Nice to meet you. I brought you some lasagna, my grandmother's recipe. Moving can be so stressful, and I thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal. Elise accepted the dish gratefully, touched by the unexpected kindness. Thank you. Would you like to come in for coffee? Sarah's face lit up. I'd love to. Over the next hour, Elise learned that Sarah was a nurse at Oregon Health and Science University, originally from a small town in eastern Oregon, and possessed of the kind of warm, open personality that made instant friendship seem possible. She chatted easily about the neighborhood, recommended local businesses, and seemed genuinely interested in Elise's story about being a freelance designer new to Portland. Are you expecting? Sarah asked finally. Her nurse's eye, having noticed what Elise's loose clothing couldn't entirely hide. Yes, twins. Actually, how exciting. Is your husband relocating here too? The question was innocent enough, but it hit Elise like a physical blow. She fumbled for an answer that wouldn't invite more questions. It's complicated. I'm doing this on my own. Sarah's expression immediately softened with sympathy. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry. It's okay. It's just recent. Well, if you need anything, and I mean anything, I'm just down the hall. Portland has some excellent single-parent support groups, and the hospital where I work has wonderful prenatal programs. After Sarah left, Elise sat in her empty apartment with the lasagna warming in the oven and something like hope stirring in her chest. Maybe it was possible to build a new life here. Maybe she could create something good for her children, even if it meant living a lie. The months that followed took on a rhythm. Elise's work grew steadily as word spread about her design skills. She developed friendships with Sarah and a few other neighbors. She attended prenatal classes and prepared for the arrival of the twins with a mixture of excitement and terror. But late at night, when insomnia drove her to her computer, she continued her secret vigil over Ethan's life. She watched him throw himself into work with an intensity that worried her. She saw him at charity events and business conferences, always alone, always maintaining a careful distance from anyone who might threaten his emotional walls. Lydia Sterling appeared frequently in society photographs, often accompanied by elegant young women who Elise recognized as potential daughter-in-law candidates. The woman was methodically working to fill the void in Ethan's life with someone of her own choosing, someone who would never threaten her control over the family empire. In her 8th month, Elise's contractions started during a particularly violent thunderstorm. Sarah drove her to the hospital through sheets of rain, holding her hand and assuring her that everything would be fine. The labor was intense but manageable. And when it was over, Elise held 2 perfect baby boys with dark hair and their father's distinctive features. She named them Owen and Miles, good, strong names that carried no connection to her past life. As she looked down at their sleeping faces, she made a promise that they would never suffer for the choices she'd been forced to make. You'll never want for anything, she whispered to them. And someday, when it's safe, maybe you'll understand why I couldn't give you the father you deserve. The first year passed in a blur of sleepless nights, first smiles, and the peculiar joy that came with watching her sons discover the world. Elise threw herself into motherhood with fierce dedication, determined to be everything to her children that she couldn't be to Ethan. She moved to a larger apartment when the boys started walking, one with a small yard where they could play safely. Her design business continued to grow, and she began to feel something like contentment, not happiness, that seemed like too much to ask, but a sense that they were building something real here. Sarah had become like a sister to her, helping with babysitting and offering the kind of practical support that Elise's fictional past couldn't provide. Other neighbors had welcomed the small family, and Owen and Miles were growing up surrounded by kindness. But even in this new life, Elise remained vigilant. She varied her routines, kept an eye out for anything unusual, and maintained the careful boundaries that kept Elise Morgan separate from Nora Whitman. Kane hadn't contacted her since delivering her to Portland, but she never forgot his warning that the threat would remain as long as Ethan's mother lived. On the boy's 2nd birthday, Elise allowed herself a small celebration with Sarah and a few other friends from the building. As she watched Owen and Miles toddle around the apartment, laughing and playing with their presents, she felt a bittersweet mixture of pride and loss. They were beautiful, brilliant children who would grow up never knowing they were heirs to a fortune. They would never experience the pressure and expectations that had shaped Ethan's life, but they would also never know the love of a father who would have adored them. That night, after the guests had gone home and the boys were asleep, Elise sat at her computer and searched for Ethan's name online. The first result was a business article from that morning announcing his engagement to Claire Donovan, daughter of a prominent Seattle family, and exactly the kind of woman Lydia would have chosen. Elise stared at the engagement photo for a long time, memorizing Ethan's face. He looked older, more serious, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he'd found a kind of peace. Claire was beautiful in the polished way of women born to wealth, with blonde hair and a practiced smile. "I hope she makes you happy," Elise whispered to the screen. "I hope you can love her the way you loved me." She deleted her browsing history and closed the laptop, then went to check on her sleeping sons. Owen had kicked off his blankets, and she tucked them around him gently. Miles was curled up with the stuffed elephant Sarah had given him, his thumb in his mouth. They were 2 years old, and Ethan had never seen them smile, would never see them take their first steps or hear their first words. The magnitude of that loss hit her anew, and she had to grip the side of the crib to keep from falling. But they were alive. They were safe. And sometimes, that had to be enough. In Seattle, Ethan Caldwell was announcing his engagement to a woman he respected but didn't love, trying to fill the void left by the woman who had betrayed him. He had no idea that his children were growing up 3 hours south of him, calling another city home and learning to walk in a world where his name was never spoken. The exile was complete, but the story was far from over. Chapter 5. Hidden Life. 12 years had transformed Elise Morgan from a frightened refugee into a woman of quiet strength and hidden depths. At 37, she bore little resemblance to the 25-year-old Nora Whitman who had disappeared from that Seattle parking garage. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with early gray that she'd stopped trying to hide. Laugh lines around her eyes spoke of genuine moments of joy, even as deeper shadows hinted at sorrows carefully contained. The cramped Portland apartment had given way to a modest 2-story house in the Hawthorne district, with a garden where Owen and Miles had learned to throw baseballs and a front porch where Elise spent summer evenings working on her laptop. The freelance graphic design work had evolved into something far more significant: investigative journalism that had earned her a reputation for tenacity and integrity under the byline E.M. Morgan. It had started almost by accident 7 years earlier while researching a design project for a local nonprofit. Elise had stumbled across financial irregularities that suggested embezzlement. Her instincts, honed by years of watching for threats, had told her to dig deeper. What she'd uncovered was a web of corruption involving 3 nonprofits and 2 city councilmen. A story that had made the front page of the Portland Tribune and launched her transition from design work to investigative reporting. Since then, she'd built a network of sources throughout the Pacific Northwest, specializing in corporate malfeasance and political corruption. Her work had taken down a predatory lender targeting elderly homeowners, exposed safety violations at a major food processing plant, and revealed a kickback scheme involving public works contracts. She'd won 2 regional journalism awards and had been offered positions at major newspapers, all of which she'd declined to maintain the independence that kept her safe. The boys were 11 now, tall and lean with their father's dark eyes and quick intelligence. Owen was the more introspective of the 2, preferring books and chess to sports, while Miles was outgoing and athletic, starring on his middle school soccer team. They were excellent students, curious about the world, and mercifully uninterested in pressing their mother for details about their father. Elise had told them the truth as far as she dared, that their father lived far away and didn't know about them, that someday she might be able to explain more. But for now they needed to trust her. It wasn't much, but it was honest, and both boys seemed to accept it as one of those adult mysteries that would make sense eventually. Sarah Tate had remained Elise's closest friend, now married to a pediatrician named Greg and living 3 blocks away with twin daughters of her own. She was one of the few people who knew Elise harbored secrets, though she'd never pressed for details. The friendship had become a lifeline, providing both practical support and emotional anchor during the hardest years. On this particular October morning, Elise sat in her home office reviewing documents for her latest investigation, a story about industrial pollution in the Columbia River that had already taken her 6 months to piece together. Her phone rang, interrupting her concentration. Elise Morgan. E.M. Morgan. This is Karen Liu from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. I'd like to discuss a freelance opportunity. Elise's blood chilled at the mention of Seattle, but she kept her voice steady. What kind of opportunity? We're working on a series about corporate influence in Pacific Northwest politics. Your work on the Portland City Council scandal caught our attention. We'd like to commission you to investigate some connections between a major Seattle corporation and state-level environmental policy. Which corporation? Sterling Enterprises. The name hit Elise like a physical blow. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Lydia Sterling's empire, the source of all her exile and pain, was finally within reach of her investigation skills. Miss Morgan, are you there? I'm here. I'm interested. Can you send me the details? Absolutely. I should mention, this story has the potential to be quite significant. We're talking about environmental violations, bribery, possibly RICO violations, the kind of investigation that could make a career or end one. Elise thought, I understand. Send me what you have. After hanging up, Elise sat staring at her computer screen without seeing it. For 12 years, she'd carefully avoided any story that might bring her into contact with Ethan's world. She'd turned down assignments in Seattle, refused to investigate any company connected to Sterling Enterprises, and maintained a careful distance from anything that might expose her true identity. But this felt different. This felt like fate. Over the following weeks, Elise threw herself into researching Sterling Enterprises with an intensity that surprised even her. The company had grown significantly since her exile, expanding into renewable energy, real estate development, and government contracting. Lydia Sterling remained as CEO, though Ethan had taken on increasing responsibility as Chief Operating Officer. What Elise discovered in her investigation made her sick. Sterling Enterprises had been systematically violating environmental regulations for years, dumping industrial waste into waterways, falsifying safety reports, and bribing officials to look the other way. The scope of the corruption was staggering, involving millions of dollars and potentially affecting the health of thousands of people. But it was what she found in the company's personnel records that nearly broke her resolve entirely. Buried in HR files she'd obtained from a whistleblower was a notation from 12 years ago. A payment of $1 million to security consulting, dated just days after her kidnapping. The payment had been authorized by Lydia Sterling personally. Elise stared at the document, her hands shaking. Here was proof, actual documentary evidence, that Lydia had paid for her abduction. It wasn't enough to convict her in court, but it was enough to confirm what Elise had always known in her heart. That night, she sat on her front porch, long after the boys had gone to bed, wrestling with a decision that could change everything. She could write the environmental story as commissioned, exposing Sterling Enterprises' crimes without revealing her personal connection. It would be justice of a sort, and it would probably destroy Lydia's empire. Or she could go further. She could investigate the kidnapping itself, try to track down Kane and his associates, build a case that might finally bring the truth to light. It would be dangerous. Kane had made it clear that the threat to her life remained as long as Lydia lived, but it might also be the only way to reclaim her real identity. The decision crystallized when Miles came out to the porch in his pajamas, rubbing sleepy eyes. Mom, you okay? You've been out here for hours. Elise looked at her son, Ethan's son, and saw the man he would become, intelligent, kind, concerned for others even when he was tired. In 12 years, he would be the age Ethan had been when they'd fallen in love. Would he grow up wondering why his mother had always been afraid? Would he resent the secrets she'd kept? I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about work. Is it a hard story? Very hard. But sometimes the hardest stories are the most important ones to tell. Miles nodded solemnly, accepting this wisdom with the gravity only 11-year-olds could muster. Then you should tell it. You always say the truth matters more than being comfortable. After he went back inside, Elise opened her laptop and began composing an email to Karen Liu. She would take the assignment, but on her terms. She would investigate Sterling Enterprises thoroughly, and she would follow the story wherever it led, even if it led back to a warehouse in Seattle and a woman who thought she'd destroyed Nora Whitman forever. But as she typed, Elise realized she was no longer the naive young woman who had been kidnapped 12 years ago. She was an experienced investigative journalist with resources, contacts, and skills that Lydia Sterling couldn't have anticipated. More importantly, she was a mother with 2 sons who deserved to know their heritage, even if they could never claim it. The war that had started in a boardroom 12 years ago was about to enter a new phase. This time, Elise Morgan had weapons that Nora Whitman had never possessed. She spent the rest of the night planning her investigation, drawing up lists of sources to contact and documents to subpoena. By dawn, she had the outline of a strategy that would either vindicate her completely or get her killed. But for the first time in 12 years, Elise felt truly alive. The truth was finally within reach, and she was done running from it. She closed the laptop and went inside to make breakfast for her sons, Ethan's sons, who would wake up soon to another day in their hidden life. But if everything went according to plan, it might be one of the last days they would have to live under assumed names. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. In Seattle, Ethan Caldwell was starting his own day, unaware that the woman he'd mourned for 12 years was about to walk back into his life, armed with evidence that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his family. The reunion neither of them had dared to hope for was still months away, but the first steps had already been taken. Elise Morgan was going home. Chapter 6. The Discovery. The permission slip had seemed innocent enough when Miles brought it home 3 weeks earlier. Sunnyside Middle School was organizing a field trip to tour several Seattle businesses as part of their career exploration program. Elise had almost said no when she saw Sterling Enterprises on the list, but refusing would have required explanations she couldn't give. What she hadn't anticipated was that Ethan would be the one conducting tours that day. The company's usual education coordinator was sick, and Ethan had volunteered to cover the student visits personally, something he'd started doing occasionally as part of a new corporate community outreach initiative. It was the kind of public engagement that helped rehabilitate Sterling Enterprises' image after several environmental lawsuits. She'd almost said no, had actually picked up a pen to mark the student will not participate box before stopping herself. How could she explain to Miles why he couldn't go on a routine school trip without revealing secrets she'd spent 12 years protecting? And more practically, refusing would only draw attention she couldn't afford. So, she'd signed the form and spent 3 sleepless nights hoping that the Sterling Enterprises portion of the tour would be handled by middle management, that Ethan would be nowhere near a group of 11-year-olds from Portland. She should have known better than to trust hope. The call came on Thursday afternoon while Elise was researching county water quality reports at her kitchen table. Her phone displayed the school's number, and she answered with the mild concern that usually accompanied midday calls from Sunnyside. "Mrs. Morgan, this is Janet Carter, the school nurse." "Miles is fine," the woman said quickly, recognizing the panic that must have been evident in Elise's voice. "But he's had what I can only describe as an unusual day. Could you come pick him up?" "What happened? Is he sick?" "Not sick." "Exactly. More like overwhelmed. He keeps asking questions about genetics and inheritance patterns. Very specific questions that seem beyond normal 11-year-old curiosity." Elise's heart hammered against her ribs. "I'll be right there." She found Miles sitting in the nurse's office, staring at his hands with an intensity that reminded her painfully of Ethan during their deepest conversations. When he looked up at her approach, she saw confusion and something else, a kind of recognition that made her knees weak. "Mom," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." The drive home was silent, except for Miles's periodic glances at her profile. Elise gripped the steering wheel and tried to prepare for a conversation she'd hoped to avoid for several more years. At home, Owen was at chess club, giving them precious privacy. They sat on the living room couch, and Miles turned to face her fully. "At the business tour today, we went to this company called Sterling Enterprises. The man who spoke to our group looked exactly like me, like exactly. Everyone noticed it." Elise's mouth went dry. "Miles, he had the same eyes, the same nose, even the same way of tilting his head when he's thinking. Mrs. Larson made a joke about how I could be his son, and he got this weird look on his face. Then he asked me what my last name was. What did you tell him? Morgan, like you taught us. But Mom, he kept staring at me for the rest of the presentation. And when it was over, he asked one of the teachers where our group was from. When he found out we're from Portland, He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Elise closed her eyes, feeling the careful structure of their hidden life beginning to crumble. What else happened? That's when I got scared and asked to go to the nurse, but I've been thinking about it all afternoon, and I keep coming back to the same thing. Miles reached over and took her hand, his young face serious beyond his years. He's our father, isn't he? The question hung in the air between them, 12 years of careful deception dissolving in the face of one child's intuitive understanding. Elise looked at her son, Ethan's son, and realized that the time for half-truths had passed. Yes, she whispered. He is. Miles nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already known. His name is Ethan Caldwell. I looked it up on my phone during the bus ride home. He's the chief operating officer of Sterling Enterprises, worth about $200 million, and he's married to someone named Claire. The casual recitation of facts hit Elise like physical blows. In the space of one afternoon, her 11-year-old son had discovered truths that could destroy the life she'd built for them. Miles, you can't tell anyone about this. Not Owen, not your friends, not anyone. Why not? And why didn't you ever tell us he was so close? Seattle is only 3 hours away. Elise stood and began pacing, her mind racing through the implications. If Ethan had recognized the resemblance as clearly as Miles had, would he investigate? Would he trace the school group back to Portland, look for students named Morgan? It's complicated, she said finally. There are people who would hurt us if they knew we existed. What people? Why? His mother. She didn't approve of me. When she found out I was pregnant with you and Owen, she did something terrible to make sure I would never be part of Ethan's life. Miles absorbed this with the gravity of a child forced to grow up too quickly. That's why we have different last names. That's why you never talk about him. I wanted to protect you, both of you, but we're not little kids anymore, Mom. Maybe it's time to stop protecting us from the truth. The wisdom in his words made Elise's chest tight. At 11, Miles was already showing the kind of moral clarity that would have made Ethan proud. But exposing that wisdom to Lydia Sterling's world could destroy it. Let me think about this, she said. I need to figure out what's safe. What if he comes looking for us? The question Elise had been avoiding crystallized into sharp focus. If Ethan had recognized Miles, if he'd made the connection between Portland and the timing, an intelligent man with unlimited resources could find them within days. Then we might have to leave Portland. Leave. Miles' voice cracked. But this is our home. All our friends are here, and Owen's chess team, and my soccer. I know this is hard, but I've kept you safe for 12 years, and I won't let anything happen to you now. That evening, after Owen had returned from chess club and both boys were supposedly asleep, Elise sat at her computer researching Ethan's activities over the past 12 years. The marriage to Claire Donovan had lasted 7 years before ending in what appeared to be an amicable divorce. There were no children from that marriage. Ethan had thrown himself into expanding Sterling Enterprises, while his mother gradually ceded more control to him. But it was the more recent articles that caught Elise's attention. Over the past 2 years, Ethan had been quietly funding scholarship programs for underprivileged youth and supporting investigations into corporate malfeasance. The man who had once been content to accept his inherited position was showing signs of the moral conscience that had first attracted her to him. A soft knock on her office door interrupted her research. Owen stood in the doorway, his dark hair tousled from sleep. Miles told me, he said simply. Elise sighed, gesturing for him to come in. I suppose you have questions, too. Just one. Owen climbed into the chair beside her desk, his serious expression so reminiscent of Ethan that her heart ached. For a moment, Elise saw a glimpse of the man her son would become. Thoughtful, principled, determined. Are you going to tell him about us? I don't know. Because I think you should. The statement surprised her. Where Miles was impulsive and emotional, Owen was analytical and careful. If he thought revelation was the right choice, he'd considered all the angles. Why? Because he has a right to know, and we have a right to know him. And because, Mom, you've been sad for as long as I can remember. You tried to hide it, but we see it. Maybe it's time to stop being sad. Elise pulled her younger son into her arms, marveling at the insights that came from children who saw the world without adult complications. What if knowing him puts you in danger? What if not knowing him means we never get the chance to find out who we really are? The question echoed in Elise's mind long after she'd tucked Owen back into bed. All night, she wrestled with possibilities and fears, trying to balance the safety she'd maintained for 12 years against the growing certainty that their hidden life was ending, whether she chose it or not. By morning, she'd reached a decision. She called Karen Liu at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and accepted the assignment to investigate Sterling Enterprises. But she also made a condition that surprised the editor. I want to interview Ethan Caldwell personally, not just his PR people or corporate communications team. I want to sit down with the man himself. That's ambitious. He rarely grants interviews to journalists, especially ones investigating his company. Then tell him E.M. Morgan wants to discuss some inconsistencies in Sterling's environmental reporting. Tell him it would be in his best interest to hear what I have to say. After she hung up, Elise sat staring at her phone, knowing she'd just taken the first step toward a reunion that could either heal 12 years of wounds or destroy everything she'd built in their place. But Owen was right. It was time to stop being sad. In Seattle, Ethan Caldwell was starting his day with a strange restlessness he couldn't shake. All night, he dreamed of dark eyes in a young face, of a resemblance so strong it had knocked the breath from his lungs. He'd asked his assistant to research the Portland school that had visited yesterday. But he wasn't sure what he was looking for. He only knew that something about that boy had awakened feelings he'd thought were dead and buried with Nora Whitman. The truth was reaching toward both of them now, and neither would be able to avoid it much longer. Chapter 7. The Return. Ethan Caldwell stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 32nd floor office, watching the Seattle skyline blur in the October rain. The request for an interview had come through official channels that morning. E.M. Morgan, an investigative journalist from Portland, wanting to discuss environmental compliance concerns regarding Sterling Enterprises. Under normal circumstances, he would have directed such requests to the legal department. The company had nothing to hide regarding their environmental practices, and corporate policy was to handle media inquiries through proper channels. But something about the name E.M. Morgan had nagged at him since his assistant first mentioned it. That, combined with his sleepless night thinking about the boy from the Portland school group, had made him agree to the meeting. The boy. Ethan closed his eyes and saw those familiar dark eyes again. The way the child had tilted his head when concentrating, the startling resemblance that had made his chest tighten with impossible hope. He'd had his assistant research the school group discreetly, but the student roster showed only last names and grade levels, nothing that would satisfy the questions burning in his mind. Mr. Caldwell, his assistant's voice came through the intercom. Miss Morgan is here for your 2 o'clock appointment. Send her in. Ethan turned from the window and moved to his desk, straightening his tie and trying to shake off the restlessness that had plagued him all week. He heard the office door open behind him and began the practice smile he used for media interviews. Miss Morgan, thank you for coming. I understand you have some questions about our environmental FIRD. The words died in his throat. Standing in his office doorway, 12 years older but unmistakably real, was Nora Whitman. Her hair was shorter now, touched with silver, and there were lines around her eyes that spoke of years he hadn't shared. She wore a charcoal business suit that suggested success and confidence, and she carried herself with an authority that the young woman he'd known was only beginning to develop. But her eyes were the same, dark, intelligent, and currently watching him with a mixture of defiance and heartbreak. Hello, Ethan. The sound of her voice, deeper now, more controlled, but still achingly familiar, sent shockwaves through his entire body. He gripped the edge of his desk to keep from falling. You're dead. The words came out as a whisper. You've been dead for 12 years. I know what you believe. I know what you were told. I saw the letter in your handwriting. You took money from my mother and disappeared. Elise stepped fully into the office and closed the door behind her. I wrote that letter, but not for the reasons you think. Ethan moved around his desk, needing to be closer, needing to confirm that she was real. Then why? Why let me believe you were dead? Why let me grieve you for 12 years? Because the alternative was actually being dead. The words hit him like a physical blow. What are you talking about? Your mother hired men to kidnap me. The plan was to kill me and make it look like a random crime. The only reason I'm alive is because the kidnappers couldn't bring themselves to murder a pregnant woman. Ethan stared at her, his mind reeling between disbelief and desperate hope. Pregnant? With twins. Your sons. She paused, letting the words sink in. They're 11 years old now, and they look exactly like you. Ethan reached for his chair, this time managing to sit down heavily. The room seemed to spin around him as he processed what she was telling him. Sons. Twins. He looked up at her, his face pale. The boy from the school group. The boy. The resemblance that had haunted his dreams suddenly made perfect sense. Those weren't just familiar features. They were his own features reflected in the face of a child he'd never known, existed. Where are they? Safe. Hidden. The same place I've been hiding for 12 years. Ethan pushed himself away from the window, anger beginning to cut through the shock. Hidden from me. You kept my children from me for 12 years. I kept them alive. Her voice sharpened, matching his anger with her own. Your mother made it very clear that my continued existence in your life was unacceptable. The kidnappers gave me a choice: disappear forever or die. I chose life for my children. My mother wouldn't what? Wouldn't hire killers to eliminate a problem? Wouldn't pay $1 million to protect her son from an inappropriate relationship? Elise reached into her briefcase and withdrew a folder, dropping it on his desk. It's all there, Ethan. Financial records showing payments to the kidnappers, environmental crimes that would destroy this company if they became public. Your mother has been systematically breaking laws for years, and murder was just one more crime to add to the list. Ethan opened the folder with trembling hands. The documents inside painted a picture of corruption that made him sick. Bribes to environmental officials, falsified safety reports, illegal dumping operations, and there, in his mother's distinctive handwriting, authorization for $1 million payment to security consulting, dated 3 days after Nora's disappearance. She told you I took her money and ran, Elise continued, her voice softer now. I asked for that lie. I thought, if you believed I had betrayed you, it would help you hate me. Hatred heals faster than grief. It didn't heal. Ethan looked up from the documents, his eyes hollow. It poisoned everything. I married Claire because I couldn't bear to be alone. But I could never love her the way I loved you. I've spent 12 years thinking the woman I adored had used me for money. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all of it. But I had to protect them. Our sons, your sons. They're brilliant and kind, and everything you would want them to be. Owen loves chess and mathematics, and has your analytical mind. Miles plays soccer, and asks questions about everything, and has your moral conviction. Ethan closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd lost. I want to see them, Elise. I want to see my sons. His voice carried a note of command that had developed over years of running a corporation. You can't tell me they exist and then keep them from me. It's not that simple. Your mother is still alive, still a threat. The man who kidnapped me made it clear that the danger would remain as long as she had power. Then we remove her from power. The certainty in his voice surprised Elise. What? Everything in this folder, if it's real, if you can prove it, would be enough to destroy her. Criminal charges, civil lawsuits, complete loss of reputation and authority. She'd be finished. And you'd be willing to do that? Destroy your own mother? Ethan looked at the documents again, seeing 12 years of lies and manipulation in a new light. She stole 12 years of my life. She stole my children's childhoods. She made me believe the woman I loved had betrayed me. He raised his eyes to meet hers. I've been her puppet long enough. It's time I acted like the majority shareholder I actually am. Elise looked surprised. Majority shareholder? I inherited controlling interest when my father died. Bavinger Wushayi. Lydia has been CEO because I didn't want the responsibility, but I've always had the power to remove her. I just never had the will to use it. Elise studied his face, seeing the man she'd fallen in love with underneath the layers of pain and cynicism. It won't be easy. She has resources, connections, lawyers who've kept her protected for years. But you have evidence, and I have inside access to company records. Together, we could bring her down. Together, we could get justice for what she took from us. They stared at each other across the office, 12 years of separation and pain hanging between them. Finally, Elise spoke. There's something else you should know. I'm E.M. Morgan now. I've been working as an investigative journalist for the past 5 years. I have contacts, sources, and a reputation for taking down corrupt corporations. This isn't just about personal revenge. It's about exposing crimes that have hurt innocent people. Ethan felt something like hope stirring in his chest for the first time in years. Then let's expose them all. And after? When your mother is in prison and the company is cleaned up and the truth is finally public, what happens to us? The question carried the weight of 12 years of lost love and impossible choices. Ethan moved closer to her, close enough to see the silver threading through her dark hair, close enough to catch the faint scent of the perfume she'd always worn. I don't know, he said honestly. I don't know if we can go back to what we were. Too much has happened. Too much time has passed. But I want to try. I want to know our sons. And I want to understand who you've become. And I want to see if there's still something left of what we had. Elise felt tears threatening for the first time since entering his office. It won't be simple. The boys don't know who you are yet. They're scared and confused. And they'll need time to adjust. Then we'll take time, however much they need. And if my mother tries to hurt them again, she won't get the chance. The steel in Ethan's voice reminded Elise of the man who'd stood up to his mother in that boardroom 12 years ago. I should have protected you then. I won't make that mistake again. Elise nodded slowly, feeling the last of her walls beginning to crumble. Okay, but we do this carefully, methodically. Your mother is dangerous, and she's had 12 years to consolidate her power. We need to be absolutely certain before we move against her. Agreed. But Elise. Yes? Thank you for coming back. Thank you for giving me the chance to fix this. Thank you for wanting to tell. As she left his office that afternoon, Elise felt something she hadn't experienced in 12 years. I hope for a future that included the man she'd never stopped loving. But in her penthouse across the city, Lydia Sterling was receiving a very disturbing report from her head of security about an investigative journalist asking uncomfortable questions and a son who was behaving strangely after meeting a boy from Portland. The war Elise thought she was beginning had actually been raging since the moment Miles recognized his father. And Lydia Sterling had never lost a war yet. Chapter 8. Gathering storm. Lydia Sterling sat in her penthouse office at 6 o'clock a.m., reviewing the security report that had been delivered to her apartment 3 hours earlier. The photograph spread across her mahogany desk told a story that chilled her to the bone. Ethan leaving the office building with a woman who looked remarkably like someone who was supposed to be dead. The same woman entering the offices of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer the next day, and Ethan himself meeting with the company's legal team in what appeared to be an urgent consultation. She picked up one photograph and studied it closely. 12 years had changed, Nora Whitman. She was older, more sophisticated, her bearing confident rather than tentative. But those eyes were unmistakable, and so was the way Ethan looked at her, with the same foolish adoration that had nearly destroyed the family's empire once before. Somehow, impossibly, the dead had returned, and they were moving against her. "Victor," she said into her phone, summoning her head of security, "I need you in my office immediately." Victor Salazar had worked for Lydia for 8 years, ever since Kane had disappeared while on what was supposed to be a routine intimidation job in Alaska. Victor never asked what had happened to his predecessor, and Lydia never volunteered the information. He was younger than Kane, more technologically sophisticated, but equally ruthless when the situation demanded it. He appeared in her office within 10 minutes, his expression professionally neutral as he took in the photographs. "Tell me everything," Lydia said without preamble. The woman calling herself E.M. Morgan requested a meeting with Ethan 3 days ago. Monitoring of his schedule showed it as a routine media interview. But afterward, Ethan immediately contacted our outside legal counsel and requested a private meeting. Yesterday, Morgan was seen entering the Seattle Post-Intelligencer offices, where she spent 3 hours in what sources describe as an intensive planning session, and the connection to Portland. Morgan lives there under that name. She's been working as an investigative journalist for 5 years with a specialty in corporate malfeasance. Her work has resulted in several high-profile criminal prosecutions. Lydia absorbed this information with growing alarm. Not only had Nora survived, she transformed herself into exactly the kind of threat Lydia had tried to eliminate 12 years ago. "There's more," Victor continued. We traced Morgan's address in Portland and conducted surveillance yesterday. She lives with 2 children, both approximately 11 years old. Boys. Twins. The words hit Lydia like a physical blow. She'd known Nora was pregnant when she'd arranged the kidnapping, but she'd assumed that problem had been eliminated along with the woman herself. The discovery that Ethan's children existed, that they'd been living 3 hours away for their entire lives, was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Photos. Victor slid 2 additional pictures across the desk. The boys were playing soccer in what appeared to be their backyard, their faces clearly visible. The resemblance to Ethan was unmistakable. The same dark eyes, the same strong jawline, even the same way of carrying themselves. DNA analysis would be redundant, Victor said quietly. There's no question of paternity. Lydia stared at the photos, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. If Ethan learned about his sons, when he learned about them, because Nora's return made that inevitable, it would change everything. Ethan's sense of duty and honor would compel him to claim his children, and with them would come their mother. The woman Lydia had spent a fortune to eliminate would not only return to Ethan's life, but would be protected by his love for children he'd never known existed. Options, she said curtly. Limited and dangerous. Morgan is no longer the naive young woman we dealt with before. She's established herself professionally, has media connections, and her investigation into our environmental practices suggests she already has damaging information. Any direct action against her now would invite scrutiny we can't afford. What about the children? Victor shifted uncomfortably. Also problematic. They're enrolled in school, part of a community. Their disappearance would trigger immediate police involvement and media attention. Then we focus on damage control. What does she have on us? Unknown, but potentially significant. Her reputation suggests she's thorough. If she's been investigating Sterling Enterprises for months, she likely has access to information that could prove embarrassing. Lydia walked to her window, looking out at the Seattle skyline that represented her empire. She'd built all of this from the foundation her father had laid, expanding it into something that touched every aspect of Pacific Northwest commerce. She wouldn't let it be destroyed by a woman who should have died 12 years ago. Increase surveillance on both Morgan and Ethan. I want to know everyone they meet with, every call they make, every document they review, and find out exactly what evidence Morgan has gathered. And if they move to expose the environmental issues, then we accelerate our timeline. The merger discussions with Pacific Energy are nearly complete. If we can finalize that before any charges are filed, Sterling Enterprises becomes a subsidiary of a larger corporation, and I transition to an advisory role with limited operational responsibility, the operational management would bear primary liability for any historical issues. That would leave Ethan responsible for crimes he didn't commit. Ethan should have chosen family loyalty over romantic delusions. That afternoon, across the city, Ethan and Elise sat in a secured conference room at the offices of Friedman, Stein, and Partners, the law firm Ethan had retained to handle the situation. The lawyer, Michael Friedman, was one of the city's most respected attorneys, known for his discretion and his success in corporate criminal cases. What you're describing constitutes multiple felonies, Friedman said after reviewing Elise's evidence. Environmental fraud, bribery, and if we can prove the connection to your kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder. Can we prove it? Ethan asked. The environmental crimes? Absolutely. You have documents, witness testimony, and physical evidence of violations. The bribery charges would be more challenging, but still viable. The kidnapping. Friedman paused, considering, that's the most serious charge, but also the hardest to prove. 12 years have passed, evidence has disappeared, and your kidnapper is apparently dead. Kane is dead? Elise felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Disappeared in Alaska 7 years ago, presumed dead, but we might not need him. If we can establish the payment trail from Sterling Enterprises to the kidnapping operation, that might be sufficient. Ethan leaned forward. What's our strongest approach? Build the environmental case first. It's solid, provable, and establishes a pattern of criminal behavior. Once that's public, we can introduce the kidnapping as part of a broader pattern of using illegal means to protect corporate interests. Timeline? Elise asked. 6 to 8 months to prepare the initial filing. The environmental case goes to federal prosecutors first. That's our strongest foundation. Once we have indictments on the environmental charges, we can introduce the kidnapping as part of a broader RICO case, showing a pattern of using illegal means to protect corporate interests. After leaving the law firm, Ethan and Elise drove to Portland in his car, the conversation heavy with anticipation and anxiety. It would be Ethan's first meeting with his sons, and despite Elise's preparation, neither of them knew how the boys would react. "They're nervous," Elise warned as they pulled into her driveway. "I've explained who you are, but they're still processing everything." "I'm terrified," Ethan admitted. "What if they hate me? What if they blame me for not being there?" "They won't. But they're smart kids, and they'll have questions you might not be ready to answer." The front door opened before they reached it, and Owen appeared, his serious expression studying Ethan with unmistakable curiosity. Miles pushed past his brother, his more outgoing nature overcoming his nervousness. "You really do look like us," Miles said without preamble. "Actually, you look like me," Ethan replied, crouching down to be at eye level with both boys. You're taller than I expected." "Mom says we get that from you too," Owen added, his analytical nature evident in the way he cataloged similarities. For the next hour, they sat in Elise's living room, navigating the awkward territory of a first meeting. Ethan answered questions about his work, his interests, and his life with the same honesty he would have shown adult strangers. The boys responded with a maturity that spoke well of Elise's parenting, but also with the natural curiosity of children discovering a missing piece of their identity. "Why didn't you know about us?" Miles asked finally. Ethan looked at Elise, who nodded encouragingly. "Because someone made sure I didn't know. Someone who thought you would be better off without me. Grandmother Lydia," Owen said with startling insight. "You know about her." "We've been researching," Miles said proudly. "Mom taught us how to use databases and public records. We found lots of stuff about Sterling Enterprises and the family history." Elisa looked surprised. "When did you—" "While you were in Seattle yesterday," Owen explained. "We wanted to understand what was happening." "And what did you find?" The boys exchanged a look that made Ethan's chest tight with pride and concern. "We found articles about environmental violations and lawsuits," Owen said. "And we found some stuff about payments to weird companies that don't seem to do anything real." "Shell companies," Miles added helpfully. "We looked that up." Ethan stared at his sons, brilliant, resourceful children who had inherited not just his appearance, but his intellect and determination. "What else?" "We found something about the bar where Grandmother Lydia met with the man who kidnapped Mom. But we need help getting the actual footage." Owen pulled out a tablet showing a news article. The Anchor Bar on Pine Street was mentioned in an old police report we found online. Mom taught us how to research public records, but the security footage would need a court order or something. The grainy black and white footage showed Lydia sitting across from a man in a dimly lit booth. The audio was poor, but certain words were clearly audible. Natural, accident, expensive, and most damning of all, it never does. "How did you?" Elise began. "Miles is really good with computers," Owen said proudly. "And I'm good at finding patterns in data. Together, we're basically unstoppable." Ethan looked at Elise, seeing his own amazement reflected in her eyes. Their 11-year-old sons had just uncovered evidence that could destroy Lydia Sterling completely. "We need to call Friedman immediately," he said. But even as they made plans to turn over the footage to the attorney, none of them noticed the van parked across the street or the telephoto lens aimed at Elise's living room windows. Lydia Sterling was about to discover that her grandsons were every bit as dangerous as their parents. Chapter 9. Justice and Revelation. The story broke on a Tuesday morning in November, sending shockwaves through Seattle's business community and beyond. The Seattle Post, Intelligencer's front page, featured a photograph of Sterling Enterprises headquarters under the headline, "Empire of Corruption. Inside the Environmental Crimes and Cover, Ups at Sterling Enterprises." Elise's byline appeared beneath the headline as E.M. Morgan, the professional name she'd built her journalism career under, marking her return to the world she'd been forced to abandon 12 years earlier. The article was devastating in its thoroughness, documenting years of illegal dumping, falsified safety reports, and systematic bribery of environmental officials. But it was the sidebar story that truly captured public attention: the kidnapping cover-up. How a corporate dynasty used murder to silence opposition. By noon, Sterling Enterprises stock had dropped 20%. By evening, federal agents were executing search warrants at 3 corporate facilities, and in her penthouse office, Lydia Sterling was watching her empire crumble in real time. "Victor," Lydia said, entering without knocking, "we have a problem." Lydia didn't look up from the bank of monitors showing news coverage of the scandal. "We have several problems." "Be specific." "Ethan is downstairs with federal agents and a warrant for your arrest." Now she turned, her steel-gray eyes sharp as razors. "What charges?" "Conspiracy to commit murder, environmental fraud, racketeering, and bribery of federal officials. They have enough evidence to hold you without bail." Lydia moved to her safe, quickly removing several documents and a laptop computer. "Evacuation protocol. Have the helicopter standing by on the roof." "Ma'am, I don't pay you to think, Victor. I pay you to follow orders." But even as she spoke, the sound of elevator doors opening in the hallway outside told her it was too late. Ethan's voice carried through the outer office, and for the first time in decades, Lydia Sterling felt the cold touch of genuine fear. The office door burst open, and Ethan entered, flanked by FBI agents and followed by Elise and the boys. Seeing her grandsons for the first time, Lydia felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride at their obvious intelligence and resemblance to the family, anger at the complications they represented, and cold calculation about how they might be used. "Ethan," she said calmly, as if this were a routine business meeting, "I see you've brought guests." "I've brought witnesses," Ethan replied, his voice carrying a weight of authority she'd never heard before. "And I've brought justice." Agent Laura Navarro, the FBI's lead investigator on the case, stepped forward with handcuffs. "Lydia Sterling, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, environmental fraud, and violation of the RICO Act." As the agent began reading her Miranda rights, Lydia focused on Elise. "So the dead have returned." "How dramatic." "The truth has returned," Elise corrected. "Everything you tried to bury is coming to light. And you think that will give you what you want? You think you can just walk back into Ethan's life and pick up where you left off? I think justice matters more than what I want." Lydia laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Justice? How naive. Do you really think arresting me will change anything? I've been preparing for this possibility for years." Agent Navarro finished the Miranda warning and moved to escort Lydia toward the door, but Ethan stepped forward. "Wait," he said. "There's something else." He nodded to Owen and Miles, who had been standing quietly beside Elise. Miles pulled out his phone and began recording as Owen stepped forward with his tablet. "Grandmother Lydia," Owen said formally, "we need to ask you some questions for our school project about family history." Lydia's eyes narrowed as she recognized the trap. But her vanity and desire to control the narrative overrode her caution. "What questions? Tell us about the time you paid someone to kidnap our mother," Miles said innocently. "That's ridiculous." "I never—" "We have the security footage from the Anchor Bar," Owen interrupted, holding up his tablet. "We can see you meeting with Kane and discussing the plan. We also have bank records showing the payments," Miles added. "And we found 3 other cases where you used Kane's services to eliminate business rivals." Lydia's composure finally cracked. "You little brats have no idea what you're interfering with. Everything I did was to protect this family, to ensure your father's future. That woman would have destroyed everything we built." "So you admit you hired someone to kill her?" Owen pressed. "I hired someone to remove a threat. If she had simply taken the money I offered like a sensible person, none of this would have been necessary. But when she refused, you ordered her death. I ordered her removal from our lives by any means necessary. If that meant death, then yes, I was prepared to accept that consequence." As they led Lydia away in handcuffs, she turned back to Ethan one last time. "You're destroying everything your grandfather built, everything our family represents." "No," Ethan replied quietly. "I'm saving what our family could become." The security footage the boys had identified proved to be the final piece of evidence prosecutors needed. Friedman had obtained a court order for the archived footage from the Anchor Bar, and the grainy video clearly showed Lydia meeting with Kane to plan Elise's kidnapping. Combined with the financial records and environmental crimes, it created an ironclad case. After the agents left with their prisoner, the office fell silent, except for the sound of Seattle rain against the windows. Ethan sank into his mother's chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. "It's over," Elise said softly. "It's just beginning," Owen corrected with the precision of someone who understood systems and consequences. "The criminal trial will take months, and there will be civil lawsuits from environmental groups and shareholders. Plus," Miles added, "someone has to run the company while all this gets sorted out." Ethan looked at his sons, brilliant children who grasped complexities that many adults would miss. "Are you two always this frighteningly smart?" "Pretty much," they said in unison. Then grinned at each other. Elise moved to stand behind Ethan's chair, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "Michael Friedman says the federal prosecutors are confident about conviction on all charges. With the confession you just recorded, she'll likely spend the rest of her life in prison. What about the company? That's up to you. You're the only family member left with authority to make decisions. You could sell it, restructure it, or rebuild it into something better." Ethan covered her hand with his own, feeling the warmth of her touch for the first time in 12 years. "What do you think I should do? I think you should follow your conscience. You always did have a better moral compass than you gave yourself credit for." Over the following weeks, the Sterling Enterprises scandal dominated headlines across the Pacific Northwest. Lydia's arrest led to a cascade of revelations about corporate corruption that touched dozens of other companies and resulted in the largest environmental fraud prosecution in state history. The boys returned to school in Portland as local celebrities, having become the youngest people ever to assist in a federal criminal investigation. Their classmates were impressed. The teachers were concerned about the precedent of 11-year-olds conducting their own law enforcement operations. Ethan split his time between Seattle and Portland, learning to be a father while managing the cleanup of his family's empire. It was exhausting work, but he found himself energized by the challenge of rebuilding something worthwhile from the wreckage of his mother's crimes. The hardest part was navigating his relationship with Elise. 12 years of separation couldn't be erased overnight, and both of them had changed in ways that made their old dynamic impossible to reclaim. But there was still something there, a foundation of love and respect that had survived everything Lydia had done to destroy it. "We're different people now," Elise said one evening as they sat on her front porch, watching the boys play soccer in the gathering dusk. "Better people, I hope," Ethan replied. "Stronger, certainly. But Ethan, I need you to understand that I'm not the same woman who disappeared 12 years ago. I've built a life here, a career, an identity that doesn't depend on anyone else. If we're going to make this work, it has to be as equals. I wouldn't want it any other way. And the boys, they're not going to just accept you as their father because of biology. You'll have to earn that relationship." Ethan watched Miles execute a perfect penalty kick, while Owen cheered from the goal. "I understand, and I'm prepared to do whatever it takes." The sound of an approaching car interrupted their conversation. Agent Navarro climbed out, her expression serious but not alarming. "Evening, folks. Sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to give you an update on the case." "Did she take a plea deal?" Elise asked. "Quite the opposite. She's demanding a trial and claiming everything she did was justified to protect her family's interests. Her lawyers are arguing temporary insanity brought on by the stress of protecting her son from an inappropriate relationship." Ethan snorted. "That sounds like Mother. The good news is that her strategy makes our case easier to prove. The confession your sons recorded is admissible, and her refusal to show remorse will work against her at sentencing." "How long until trial?" 6 months. Maybe 8. But I wanted to prepare you. She's also demanding visitation rights with her grandsons." The word sent a chill through both Elise and Ethan. They looked at their boys, still playing innocently in the yard, and Ethan felt a surge of protective fury that surprised him with its intensity. "Over my dead body," he said quietly. That's essentially what the judge said. Given the circumstances of her crimes, there's no way she'll be granted access to the children. But she'll keep trying, probably through the entire legal process. After Agent Navarro left, Ethan and Elise sat in contemplative silence. Finally, Ethan spoke. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to give me an honest answer." "Okay. Do you think we can make this work? Not just the legal stuff or the business or even co-parenting. I mean us." Do you think there's still enough left of what we had to build something new? Elise was quiet for a long moment, watching their sons. When she spoke, her voice was careful but hopeful. I think there's only one way to find out. The trial of Lydia Sterling was still months away, but the hardest part of their ordeal was finally over. For the first time in 12 years, the truth was no longer hidden, and the future, uncertain as it was, belonged entirely to them. Chapter 10. Redemption and New Beginnings. 8 months later, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and cameras as Elise emerged into the Seattle sunlight, blinking in the harsh glare of media attention. Behind her, Ethan held the hands of Owen and Miles, both boys looking older than their 12 years after months of legal proceedings and public scrutiny. "Miss Morgan," a reporter called out, "how do you feel about the verdict?" Elise paused, considering her words carefully. After 8 months of testimony, evidence, and legal maneuvering, Lydia Sterling had been convicted on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, environmental fraud, racketeering, and bribery of federal officials. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice finally served. "I feel relief," she said simply. "Relief that the truth has been heard, that justice has been done, and that my family can finally move forward." "Mr. Caldwell," another reporter shouted, "what's next for Sterling Enterprises?" Ethan stepped forward, his hand still firmly clasping Miles's. "Sterling Enterprises is being restructured as a public benefit corporation focused on environmental restoration and sustainable development. We're hiring exclusively from companies that share our commitment to ethical business practices, and we're donating 50% of profits to environmental cleanup efforts. And personally, are you and Miss Morgan rekindling your relationship?" Ethan and Elise exchanged a look, the kind of wordless communication that had developed over months of rebuilding trust and rediscovering each other. "We're taking things one day at a time," Elise replied diplomatically. But the truth was more complicated and more hopeful than any soundbite could capture. The past 8 months had been a delicate dance of learning to be a family while processing years of trauma and separation. Ethan had moved to Portland 3 months earlier, buying a house just 6 blocks from Elise's so the boys could easily move between both homes. They had attended family therapy sessions to help Owen and Miles process the revelation of their parentage and the crimes committed by their grandmother. The boys had adapted with the resilience of children, though Owen still sometimes woke from nightmares about his mother disappearing again, and Miles struggled with anger toward the grandmother he'd never known. Ethan had thrown himself into being the father he'd missed 12 years of being. He attended soccer games and chess tournaments, helped with homework, and discovered the profound joy and terror that came with loving someone more than your own life. The boys had tested him at first. Owen with intellectual challenges that required Ethan to research topics ranging from quantum physics to medieval history. Miles with emotional demands that forced Ethan to confront his own upbringing and choose a different path. But gradually, tentatively, they had become a family. Elise had been the hardest for Ethan to win back. Not because she didn't love him, that had never been in question, but because she'd learned to be complete without him. The woman he'd fallen in love with had been dependent on others for her sense of worth. The woman she'd become was successful, confident, and fiercely protective of the independence she'd fought to build. Their courtship, for that's what it was despite their history, had been careful and deliberate. Coffee dates after the boys were asleep that sometimes ended in passionate kisses, sometimes in heated arguments about parenting approaches. Long conversations about everything they'd missed in each other's lives, mixed with comfortable silences that felt like coming home. Gradual introduction of physical intimacy as they rediscovered each other's changed bodies and hearts. Slowly, carefully, they had built something new on the foundation of what they'd once shared. 3 weeks after the trial ended, Ethan arrived at Elise's house for their usual Sunday dinner to find candles lit throughout the living room and the boys dressed in their best clothes. "What's the occasion?" he asked suspiciously. "Mom has an announcement," Owen said, with barely contained excitement. "Actually," Miles corrected, "we all have an announcement." Elise emerged from the kitchen wearing the blue dress Ethan had bought her for their first public appearance together since her return. She looked nervous and beautiful and determined all at once. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to the couch. Ethan obeyed, his heart hammering with anticipation and fear. "Elise, if this is about us moving too fast, it's not." She took a deep breath. "Ethan, 8 months ago, you asked me if I thought we could make this work, if there was enough left of what we had to build something new. I remember, I told you there was only one way to find out, and I think we found out. She moved to sit beside him on the couch, taking his hands in hers. I love you. Not the way I loved you 12 years ago. That was young love, passionate but untested. I love you the way a woman loves a man she's seen face the worst, and choose to be better. I love your stubbornness and your integrity, and the way you never gave up, hoping for something most people would have declared impossible. Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion. Elise, I'm not finished. I love the father you've become to our sons. And I love the man you're becoming as you rebuild your family's legacy into something honorable. I love that you ask my opinion before making decisions and that you respect my independence even when it frustrates you. Mom. Miles interrupted impatiently. Just ask him already. Elise laughed, tears streaming down her face. Ethan Caldwell, will you marry me? The words hit him like a physical blow. In all his imagining of this moment, he'd never considered that she might be the one to propose. He began, then stopped, overwhelmed. Dad, Owen said gently, using the word he'd finally started saying just last month. She's waiting for an answer. Ethan looked around the room at the candles, at his sons' expectant faces, at the woman who had been lost to him and found again. Yes, he said simply. Yes, absolutely, yes. Elise launched herself into his arms, and the boys cheered as if their favorite team had just won the championship. For several minutes, the living room was chaos. Hugging and laughing and tears and excited chatter about wedding plans and moving arrangements. Finally, Ethan pulled back to look at Elise's face. I have to ask, why did you propose to me instead of waiting for me to ask you? Because I spent 12 years waiting for my life to begin again. I'm done waiting for other people to make the first move. Fair enough. But I have a condition. Oh? Ethan reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. I still get to give you this. Elise stared at the box, recognizing it immediately. That's the ring I gave you 12 years ago. I bought it back from the police evidence storage after the trial. It seemed like it belonged with you. With trembling fingers, Elise opened the box to reveal the simple solitaire diamond Ethan had chosen with such care all those years ago. It looked smaller than she remembered, but infinitely more precious. It's perfect, she whispered. Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger. And for a moment, time collapsed. They were 25 and 28 again, young and naive and completely in love. But they were also older and wiser, scarred by experience, but strengthened by survival. I have one more condition, Ethan said. Name it. I want us to renew our vows in front of everyone. No hiding, no secrets, no compromise. I want the whole world to know that I'm marrying Elise Morgan, the investigative journalist who brought down Sterling Enterprises and saved my soul in the process. And I want everyone to know that I'm marrying Ethan Caldwell, the man who chose love and justice over loyalty to corruption, even if it means dealing with more media attention, especially if it means that our story is public now anyway. Might as well control how it ends. The wedding took place 3 months later in Elise's backyard, transformed by strings of lights and flowers into something magical. The guest list was small but meaningful. Sarah and her family, Michael Friedman and his wife, Agent Navarro, several colleagues from Elise's journalism career, and Ethan's few remaining friends who had supported him through the scandal. Owen and Miles served as joint best men, having argued successfully that traditional wedding roles were less important than family unity. Now, 12 years old, after the months of legal proceedings, they wore matching navy suits and expressions of profound satisfaction at having successfully orchestrated their parents' reunion. Elise walked herself down the aisle, a deliberate choice that spoke to her independence and her refusal to be given away by anyone. Her dress was simple ivory silk, elegant but not ostentatious, befitting a woman who had built her own life and chose freely to share it. Ethan waited for her at an arch covered in white roses, his hands steady and his eyes clear. When she reached him, he took her hands and spoke the vows they had written together. Elise, 12 years ago, we were torn apart by forces beyond our control, but we survived. We grew. We became better people because of what we endured. Today, I choose you not just as the woman I love, but as my equal partner in building a life based on truth, justice, and the kind of love that can weather any storm. Elise's voice was steady as she replied, Ethan, you could have chosen bitterness when you learned the truth about what happened to us. Instead, you chose forgiveness and fought for justice. You could have resented the years we lost, but instead you celebrated the years we found. I choose you as my husband, my partner, and the father of our children, knowing that whatever challenges we face, we'll face them together. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared tasted like coming home. The reception was a celebration not just of their marriage, but of survival and redemption. Speeches ranged from heartfelt to hilarious, with Owen providing a statistical analysis of marriage success rates that somehow managed to be both encouraging and entertaining, while Miles offered a soccer metaphor that compared their relationship to a championship game that had gone into overtime but finally reached a decisive victory. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Elise and Ethan found themselves alone on the back porch, watching the boys chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. No regrets? Ethan asked, his arm around her waist. None. You? Only that it took us 12 years to get here. Maybe we needed those 12 years. Maybe we had to become who we are now to build something that could last. Ethan considered this, watching Owen catch a firefly and immediately release it while Miles attempted to catch 3 at once. They're incredible, aren't they? They're yours. Ours. I missed so much of their lives. But you're here for the rest of it. And Ethan, they adore you. You know that, right? Before he could answer, Miles ran up to them, slightly out of breath from chasing insects. Dad, are you going to move into our house now, or are we moving into yours? Actually, Elise said, smiling, we're all moving into a new house. One that's ours from the beginning. With a bigger yard? Owen asked, appearing with a firefly cupped gently in his hands. With a bigger yard, Ethan confirmed. And a workshop where Mom can spread out all her investigation files. And a workshop, Elise agreed. And maybe a dog? Miles asked hopefully. Ethan and Elise looked at each other and burst out laughing. We'll discuss the dog, they said in unison. As the boys ran off to continue their firefly hunt, Ethan pulled Elise closer. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For coming back. For giving us another chance. For raising our sons to be the kind of people who could track down evidence and bring justice to bear. For being brave enough to fight for what was right, even when it meant risking everything you'd built. Thank you for wanting me back, even after everything that happened. Thank you for choosing our family over your mother's legacy. Thank you for proving that some things are worth waiting 12 years for. They stood together in the soft evening light, watching their sons play in a yard that would soon belong to all of them, planning a future that had seemed impossible just a year before. Lydia Sterling was serving her life sentence in a federal prison, her empire dismantled and her name synonymous with corporate corruption. The environmental damage she'd caused would take decades to fully remediate. But Ethan had committed the reformed Sterling Enterprises to funding that restoration as its primary mission. Kane was still dead, his crimes buried with him in an unmarked grave in Alaska. But the security footage had provided enough evidence to confirm his role in the kidnapping conspiracy. Victor Salazar had cooperated with federal authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing details about Lydia's other illegal activities, spanning nearly 2 decades. But Ethan and Elise Caldwell were very much alive, married, and building something beautiful from the ashes of everything they'd lost. And in the gathering darkness of their new backyard, 2 12-year-old boys caught fireflies and made plans for a future where truth and justice had finally won. The story that had begun with hatred and corruption had ended with love and redemption. And they all lived, if not quite happily ever after. Then at least honestly ever after, which turned out to be more than enough.